Title of my paper is Pandemics as Force Majeure in Construction Contracts, Key Considerations, Implications and Recommendations. And I am Zeynep Sozen from the Department of Architecture of Istanbul Medipol University. In this paper, I basically aim to examine force majeure clauses under most widely used standard contractual forms, but focusing particularly on the infectious disease as an exceptional event or force majeure. But I will be focusing on the consequences of the infectious disease, but the analysis of the consequences shall be limited to time and cost entitlement. The term force majeure has been borrowed from the Napoleonic Code of 1804, but it has been derived from the Roman term vis major, which means superior force, or casus fortuitus, an accident against which prudence could not have been provided. The term force majeure is not a common law concept, yet we can see it in contracts governed by both civil law and common law jurisdictions. Analyzing the term, we can look at the essential elements of the term. There are basically four elements that we can see. One is unforeseeability. The event that qualifies as a force majeure event should be unforeseeable at the time of contracting. The second element is unavoidability. The event that qualifies as force majeure should be beyond the control of either party. Thirdly, this event must be external. It must be an objective condition existing externally. This I also interpret as not being attributable to the other parties. It's an external event that is unavoidable and unforeseeable. And fourthly, this event that qualifies as a force majeure event must render performance of the contract impossible. So these are the essential elements of the term. And the coverage of the term is twofold. The term force majeure can cover natural events, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, fire, plague, other natural disasters, and of course the disease is among the natural events, or man-made or political events such as terrorism, riots, civil disturbances, war, acts of civil or military authority, national emergencies, strikes, of course excluding strikes which are by the contractor's personnel or by any of its subcontractors, nuclear or chemical contamination, pressure waves from devices traveling at supersonic speeds, and so forth. This term is defined in a clause. First of all, now let's look at the structure of the force majeure clause, if there is one. This clause is structured basically and generally in two parts. The first part generally defines the term and lists the criteria that need to be fulfilled for qualification as force majeure. An example, a good example is from the FIDIC 1999 editions. In this edition, force majeure is defined as an exceptional event which is beyond a party's control, which such party could not have reasonably provided against before entering into the contract, which having arisen, such party could not reasonably have avoided or overcome And finally, which is not substantially attributable to the other party. So the first part of the clause, typical clause, looks something like that. The force majeure elements are enumerated, and then there's generally a second part in this clause which lists events that could constitute force majeure. And in designing the second part of this clause, there are basically two approaches. One is providing an exhaustive list of events. In this case, force majeure will be available only for the events that are specifically covered by the list. The second approach is a non-exhaustive one. In this one, an event not specifically listed bears the potential of triggering the force majeure clause, provided it satisfies the criteria that were enumerated in the first section of this clause. So in the second approach, the list is supplemented by a phrase like, these are the events that we mean by force majeure events, but the events are not limited to the events listed below. And then there are other clauses that are related to this force majeure clause. These other related clauses complement the clause by providing requirements for invoking the clause, like proof of causation, notice requirements, forms of notices, timing of notices, contractors' prevention and mitigation duties, and so forth. And of course, there are the consequences of force majeure, sometimes listed under related different clauses, like entitlement to time extension, cost, suspension, and termination. And as I said earlier, our analysis will be limited to analyzing the time and cost consequences. Now, coming to the disease, the infectious disease as force majeure, we have become aware of a number of different types of contagious diseases. And through this COVID-19 process, that there is of course, we have experienced different types of diseases in the past, but there seems to be a hierarchy of diseases, the lowest one of which is the endemic. The endemic is a contagious disease that is restricted to a geography or population group. The epidemic, which most common forms mention, is a contagious disease that spreads over a geography in excess of normal expectancy. And the pandemic is a global one. It spreads over countries and continents. Now, there are a number of issues that we should discuss here. First of all, the issue of coverage. If we have an exhaustive list in the force majeure clause, the disease may not qualify if the exhaustive list does not cover this disease. Or if there is a specific reference to a category such as a pandemic, the epidemic may not be covered under this clause as a lower category. Or if there is a reference to an epidemic, the endemic may not be covered by this clause. The second issue is that of an official declaration. We refer to an authority, and the authority has been the World Health Organization. So, if there is the question of official declaration, the wording of the World Health Organization official declaration is important. How does the World Health Organization classify this disease? Is it an epidemic, endemic, or pandemic? This will be an important issue. And in addition to that, the timing of the official declaration, because the World Health Organization takes the time to categorize this disease. This would be important in terms of the claim lapse period for the contractor. Generally, the contractor is required to notify the employer as soon as he or she becomes aware of the disease. But when is the time limit for the contractor to notify it? That is, when should the contractor be deemed to have been aware of this disease? These are important issues. So now coming to the impact of the disease. If the disease is force majeure, then does it entitle the contractor to excusable delay, to time entitlement, to compensation, or both? This I have compared across a number of international forms. One is the AIA series A201 2017, ConsensusDOCS 200, FIDIC 99 editions, FIDIC 2017 editions, FIDIC-MDB Harmonized Edition 2010, NEC4 Suite 2017, JCT Design and Build 2016, and EJCDC Standard General Conditions. In any case, those agreements between the owner and the contractor. Now, if we look at this particular table, this table analyzes these major forms, compares these major forms in terms of basically 5 categories. The first is whether this form has an explicit force majeure clause. That is a clause that is titled force majeure. And if not, in the second column, we analyze whether there is a relevant clause, whether the disease is somehow treated under a relevant clause, which may not be called a force majeure clause, but may be called something else. The third column analyzes whether there is a specific reference to the contagious disease in this form. And finally, the fourth and fifth columns analyze the time extension entitlement and the cost entitlement. Now, looking at these columns and existence of a force majeure clause in this particular form, we can see that only FIDIC 99 editions, FIDIC-MDB 2010, and JCT Design Build 2016 have an explicit force majeure clause. The others do not have force majeure clauses, but they do have relevant clauses. In FIDIC 2017, the relevant clause is called exceptional events. In NEC4, these are compensation events. In AIA 201, the situation may be treated under delays and extensions of time. ConsensusDOCS 200.1, time and price impacted materials. And EJCDC, delays in contractors' progress and emergencies. And is there a reference to the disease? In ConsensusDOCS and in EJCDC, there is a specific reference to the disease as epidemics. In the others, there is no specific reference to a disease. In terms of time extension, we can see that all of these forms provide for time extension. So the contractor will be entitled to time extension in any case. However, cost is another matter. There may be alternative routes, alternative ways of cost entitlement. In AIA, subclause 833 does not preclude recovery of damages for delay under other provisions of the contract documents. These may be owner's failure to provide evidence of financial arrangements, and the related one may be change orders, construction change directives, work stoppages caused by the owner's failure of payment, suspension by the owner for convenience, and maybe most relevant, emergencies. The language of this clause, subclause, could be negotiated by the parties. In ConsensusDOCS, time and price impacted materials amendment and Schedule A could be used as an addendum to a contract, and the parties can agree upon a method for establishing the market price as of the date of the amendment and a method for calculating an adjustment in prices. The FIDIC forms, in the 1999 forms, there is the force majeure clause, and the cost entitlement would be possible, but restricted to man-made events in the country, defined as the country in which the site or most of it is located. However, alternative routes could be possible, provided actions by the local authorities or governments are considered as changes in legislation, changes in laws of the country, and the contractor may be entitled to recovery of costs under subclause 13.7 under the 1999 editions MDB 2017 and under exceptional events of the 2017. In NEC 3 and NEC 4, the disease is clearly a compensation event as an event which stops the contractor completing the works or stops the contractor completing works by the date shown on the accepted program. So it does provide for cost entitlement. However, in JCT, the contractor has to establish a relevant matter for recovery of costs. Subclause 421 lists events that are relevant matters. However, the infectious disease is not contained in the list. Indirect routes, however, could be possible if permission or approval required by a statutory authority is delayed, the employer issues an instruction to postpone any of the works to be done under the contract, or employer prevents the contractor from doing the works. In EJCDC forms, these forms do mention epidemics in terms of delays and do provide time extension. However, the contractor is not entitled to cost compensation. It's an excusable but non-compensable event. Now there are these key considerations. First of all, we go through the unforeseeability element when we are trying to draft a new force majeure clause. Contagious diseases may have become foreseeable from now on, so we have to consider the force majeure event as a foreseeable now from now on. So this is a sensitive matter to be taken into consideration in the drafting of new force majeure clauses. Governing law may always make a difference. So the foreseeability element should be considered because, as we know, some risks like earthquakes are more foreseeable in some parts of the world than in the others. For instance, in Turkey. Employers might consider specifying processes for dealing with infectious diseases and requirements in future contracts under employers' requirements, describing pre-access testing for personnel and equipment, periodic health controls. The second issue to be considered is the impossibility element. We know that the performance of the construction contract was not absolutely impossible. In the case of construction, in many projects, work went on although there were material shortages, logistics breakdowns, delays in receipt of permission. It did slow down, but we cannot say that it was absolutely impossible. So we have to consider these two elements, and the impossibility element can be relaxed as it has been relaxed in England and the US. The clause should address the contractor's rights for partial and absolute impossibility due to the effects of the disease. And impossibility can be temporary. Performance may be resumed after the party ceases to be affected by the event. And thirdly, there are the definition issues, because there may be differences between the categories of infectious diseases, and these do have implications, as we have emphasized before. And a more flexible term, such as a communicable disease outbreak, might be more practical. It could capture diseases that do not qualify as epidemics. And finally, we should give consideration to the authority that is designated for official declaration. Coming to the conclusions, we can say that the interpretation of a force majeure clause will vary across jurisdictions, for one thing, and probably there will be civil codes and laws responding to the new situation. However, contracting parties shall respond to it faster than the civil codes, which are rather more static, but the parties will probably be redrafting and or negotiating force majeure clauses in their contracts, with contractors preferring wider definitions, employers preferring narrower definitions. And we can say that in drafting a force majeure clause, the parties should consider the elements of foreseeability from now on, impossibility from now on, language and wording of the clause, that is the qualifying events, and finally the designation of the authorized institution. Thank you for listening.